going to cue something up real quick. Okay, there it is. So let me just introduce myself a little bit and say the context that I'm coming from. My name's Ken Burak. I'm a philosophy professor in Pennsylvania at Northampton Community College. The philosophical context in which I'm normally operating, I really identify myself with the deep ecology philosophy movement. Philosophy has sort of one overarching command to know thyself. And all philosophical movements in one way or another have to some or other address a few questions. One is, well, who am I? How is it possible that I don't know who I am, that I think I'm somebody, but if you're telling me that I'm actually not that person, I mean, if you're telling me, if I tell you, a command to sit down, that would be weird because you've already done it. Similarly, if I tell you know yourself, that's kind of a weird command. It's like, how can I possibly not know myself? What happens such that I'm actually B, but I think I'm A? And what methodology can I use to actually find out who I am? So I'm interested in that part. I'm interested in what kind of catalysts there can be in our lives, what sort of events or experiences can happen in our lives, as a result of which we come closer to finding out who exactly it is that we really are. In the deep ecology movement, I think in some way or another, the answer always comes down to that we are part of the earth. That animals, plants are part of the earth, and we're animals, and we're part of this earth, and we've come to think of ourselves as something other than this earth, that nature is something out there, that the earth is out there, and we're over here. And so I think that a question in the deep ecology movement is, how can we get people to have an experience? How could we facilitate an experience as a result of which somebody would say, whoa, I'm actually not a human standing opposed to the rest of nature. I'm actually a part of nature. So what kind of catalyst for that kind of self-reflection can there be? I think that the basic income movement is a really interesting moment. I'll try to make the case that when you have a conversation with somebody and you say to them something like, I think that everybody should just be given money. And the response is, oh, but if everybody just had money, then they wouldn't work, and all the kind of things that we deal with in that kind of moment of interaction. I think that moment, I'm going to try to make the case today, that moment is, if nothing else, a moment where they just learn something about themselves. They've learned something about who they're being, and I'm going to make the case that what they've learned is, oh my God, I'm a monster. Because what does a monster do? In Monsters, Inc., monsters do what monsters do, which is they scare people. And I think that there's a moment that all teachers have where, I think of myself as, oh, I teach, that's what I do, I'm a teacher. That's who I am. Somebody asked me, who are you, what do you do? And I started off, I said, I'm Ken Burak, I'm a teacher. But there's a moment that all teachers have when we're developing this nice rapport. How many teachers are there in the house, by the way? Wrong, you're all monsters. I mean, you might have that experience. I think all teachers have had an experience. So I'll ask you if you've had this experience, and you can raise your hand, where you give a student a bad grade, and you see something in their eyes. You see like a kind of fear in their eyes, a horror, maybe like, oh my God, what are my parents going to do? Am I going to become a failure? It's really terrible. And you have this moment where you feel like, oh my God, what do I do? What am I doing to this kid? And then maybe the kid is like suddenly scared of you. It could be a college student, it could be an adult, whatever, and they're afraid of you. And they realize that like, wow, you have this power over them, and you can take their future away. And they're scared, and you feel bad, and you feel kind of confusing when you have that moment. So raise your hand if you've ever had that experience. I certainly have. And then they're sort of like, I don't understand, why don't we have a good relationship? I'm trying so hard as a teacher, I'll try so hard to be like one big family. You can have that experience as a boss as well, as an employer. Are there any employers in the house? Anybody whose livelihood, money, and hence life depends on your approval of them?
But I have before.
Okay, well, as an employer, have you ever had an experience where you realize that you're trying to like make this nice relationship with somebody, and you realize that like there's this asymmetry because actually you're responsible for, you can decide whether or not they have food to eat, but they're not deciding that about you. And you might have a moment where you see them as scared. You know, maybe they show up late to work, and you see them. I remember I've had very few experiences like this. I'm a teacher, but I've had very few experiences as an employer. But I did have one. I was overseeing this tutoring organization, and I saw a student. I was on the second floor. I was looking out the window, and I saw a student tutor who really needed the job, and I knew she really needed the job, and she was really having a hard time keeping her life together. And I learned later that she was living out of her car, and I saw her running late again. I'm late all the time too. And she was running late again to the building where she was going to be tutoring, and she was like trying to open a door, and she couldn't get it open. She was just turning the handle the wrong way, and I'm watching her, and I had a talk with her where I said, like, listen, you're really cool. I really love the way you tutor and everything, but if you're late again, we really are going to have to question whether or not this is going to work. And I saw her kind of do that, and I just saw her kind of like stand back for a moment, and she just like looked like she was about to cry. And I was thinking like, wow. I looked at her and I realized like she's about to cry because she's afraid about what I'm gonna say, you know, because I'm paying her. And I felt like, wow, I'm kind of like a monster. Anyway, raise your hand if you've seen Monsters, Inc. Just throwing out there, raise your hand if you love it. Raise your hand if you watched it and thought, this is the blueprint for the revolution of the basic income movement. Solely as Philosopher King. Okay, so here's a quick synopsis. I'm sorry for people who haven't seen it yet. There's totally going to be spoilers in it. Basically, it turns out monsters are totally real, and they are in children's closet. There is this other dimension where monsters live in this city called Monstropolis. And Pixar made this great movie about Monstropolis, and there are these monsters that go to work every day. And the monsters go to work, and I'm sure that they would, if asked, who are you, they would say, I'm a monster. But one monster is going to hear it in a particular way in the movie. The movie is a story for me about self-consciousness, a story where a monster realizes, oh my God, I'm a monster. Like that moment when a teacher realizes, oh, I'm a monster. That's what I scare people to get them to work. I scare students to get them to read. Anyway, so it turns out monsters are real, and the way that this society works, where they get their energy isn't from coal or natural gas or solar or wind, they get it from fear. They literally mine children's bedrooms for fear. So what happens is they go to this factory, and there's an assembly line. They punch in, there's like, hey, Sal, or the wife and kids, you know, good day at work today. And so there's an assembly line, and the doors come, and they're doors to human children's bedrooms. And so, it's great. And so I wish we could just sort of like watch the movie. Anyway, so the doors come down the assembly line, and this one monster, Sully, who's big and blue and cute, he's the philosopher of the revolution, and we're watching his awakening in the movie. He opens the door, he goes in, just like all the other monsters, into the children's bedroom. There's a sleeping child. You know, they do their thing, they scare them, the kid screams, they capture the fear of the child, leave, go back to their world, plug it in, high-five somebody. There's all sorts of like competitions and worker incentive programs to try to scare children more. And then there's this pipeline, they don't really go into the infrastructure of it, but somewhere there's this pipeline from the mining camp, where, you know, these monsters are miners, and they go into children's room and mine their negative emotions, and they get the negative emotions, they get the fear, and then they use it somewhere or other to transform it into electricity and stuff. The humans fear the monsters. Importantly, the monsters fear the humans as well. I'll come back to that, but I think that's really relevant. So what happens is, one of the humans, a little kid, Boo, a little girl, she gets through into the monsters world. And there's these two monsters, Sully and Wachowski are the main characters, and they befriend Boo. And they come to not be afraid of her. Boo comes to not be afraid of them, and they have this nice relationship, and they're sort of trying to protect Boo because they know all the monsters are going to freak out if they find out about Boo, both at Boo and at they're going to freak out at the monsters too. So there's all sorts of fear dynamics going on. I've diagrammed 13 levels of fear that are operating in a movie that I think parallel exactly the 13 levels of fear that are operating in our society that we as a movement, I think we need to overcome. Like the fear, like, oh my God, people won't work. Anyway, so as the movie goes on, Sully has an experience that I'm going to show you of self-reflection, where he is asked in a training session, like the new recruit monsters are not doing a good job of scaring people, and Sully's so good at it, the boss, Waternoose, enlists Sully to do a scare demonstration. And that's the scene that I want to show. And in the scare demonstration, he's scaring, he's doing a scare to show the recruits how it's done, and Boo is in the room. The human is in the room. And Boo gets scared and is suddenly scared of Sully. And Sully's confused. Like, why are you afraid of me? And then in what I think is perhaps the most beautiful moment in the history of cinematic, I am serious, in the history of cinematic moments of making a cinematically compelling and philosophically interesting moment of self-reflection, of self-consciousness, where you see yourself in a way that you didn't know that was you. And then you say, I can't deny it, it's right there. I'm a monster. In that moment of self-reflection happens in this movie, in this scene, and he kind of like doesn't understand, like, well, Boo, why are you afraid of me? And then he sees it, he's like, oh, I understand why you're afraid of me, because I'm a monster. All right, so let's watch the scene. Hopefully this is gonna work. But so Boo is hot. Boo is, can you see that?
Yeah.
Maybe if there's a light to turn on. Anybody know how to do that?
Anybody know how that works?
It's only a minute scene.
The touch panel's been disabled.
But you know, if it's the most important moment in cinematic history, you don't have to see it. I think they got
It's
it.
actually the ones in front you want.
You had it on that side.
So you get in trouble here, but we can micromanage your economy.
All right, let's just. Okay, great. All right, so everybody ready? So that's Boo. She's being hidden to look like a monster. Everything's important. Anyway, that's Wachowski, the green one. Okay, great. There we go.
Now, give us a big, loud roar.
Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
That's Waternoose, the boss.
Mr. Waternoose, there's no time for this. Come on, what are you waiting for? Roar! But sir, roar! Well done. Ooh. All right, gentlemen. I hope you learned a valuable lesson in scaring today. Ooh. Ooh. Oh, it's me. The child.
Sir, she is a toxin. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me.
No, it's okay. I was just. No, don't be scared. That wasn't real. It's just a. I was just. Ooh.
Okay, that's a. Great. Okay. Can we just keep watching that?
6 minutes.
Great. Okay, we can't keep watching this. Or we could, but I have a few other things that might be interesting. Okay. So anyway, so you see it. And so what happens in the movie is, a lot happens, but the most important thing that happens is, one thing is that every time Boo laughs, and is like really filled with joy, there's a power surge. And what they realize, and the next thing that happens is, as a result of that scene, Sully has what I would call a moral crisis, where he really realizes, like, wow, I'm a monster, like what I do is terrible. And he feels really awful about it, and he's really confused. And he has these like interactions with Waternoose, the boss, and that goes something like this. Sully's saying, like, wow, we're monsters, we scare people, that's terrible, we run our society on fear. And then Waternoose's response is something always along the lines of like, look, do you like the fact that the lights are on? Do you like the fact that the civilization is working? Well, guess how we get the civilization to work? Fear. And it's sort of like, Sully's sort of like confused and shut down by it. But then by the end of the movie, they come to the realization, in part because Boo keeps making the lights flicker when she laughs, they realize, like, whoa, what if it's the case that we could get our society to work not only just as well on joy and happiness as we can on fear, but what if we can get it to work even better? And so by the end of the movie, in one of the final scenes, you see the monsters going into work, like, hey Sam, how are the wife and kids? And they punch in and they go over to the assembly line and the doors are coming and you're wondering, whoa, nothing changed. And they open a door and they go in, and this time instead of scaring the kids, they do this sort of like comedy routine and they make the kids laugh and have a really great time. And then they bottle the joy and they run their society better than they ever did on fear in the first place. And so what I'm thinking is that, you know, when we have those experiences, and I think that everybody at some point in their lives, we're always caught in a situation where we're both the person who's scared and being motivated by fear. You know, as a teacher, I show up to work. I sometimes find myself like running to work to get there on time because, you know, I'm scared that I'll get fired and then I won't have money and then I'll die, you know, starving alone in an alleyway. And then, but I'm also scaring my students and telling them, like, if you don't read Plato and watch Monsters, Inc. and connect them, then I will give you a bad grade, and then you won't get a good GPA, and then you won't get a degree, and then you won't get a job, and then you won't work, and then you won't get money, and then you won't get food, and then you'll die. Why aren't we friends? Why are you so scared of me? You know? But we have that moment where, like, wow, this is really terrible. I scare people for a living. You know, when we have that moment I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, where we realize, like, well, what I do is I scare people. Maybe I'm a cop, and I realize I'm driving around. I understand why I don't have a good relationship with my community, and I realize, like, oh, it's because I'm the person who scares them and says, like, do what I tell you to do, follow the rules, or I'll lock you in a cell, in a cage. So, or I'll give you a ticket. And so, and then the first moment is like, oh, I scare people, and the next moment is like, yeah, but that's absolutely necessary, whether I have a voice inside of me that says that or somebody else says it to me, that that's necessary to scare people because we need fear to run this society. How am I doing? 2 minutes, oh my God. And so, but then what Monsters, Inc. introduces is the idea of a third moment in that conversation, where the first moment is, wow, I scare people, that's terrible thing to do. And then the second moment is, yeah, but come on, we have to scare people or else society won't work. In the context of basic income, we say, like, you know, the first moment is, it's terrible that people are faced with the fear of, like, dying for lack of funds. You know, we're unique as a species in that we both pride ourselves on being really intelligent, and yet without money, for most of us, especially modern humans, we die. And so we're being motivated by fear of death. You know, come to work or you'll die. Get good grades or you'll literally die. I mean, it's a weird thing. If you ever experienced, I've been homeless and I've seen what it's like to actually be hungry and realize it's like, wow, I could conceivably die without money. That's an intense thing. And when you say to people, like, basic income, it's a really good idea because then people, you know, shouldn't have to fear dying as a motivation. And the response is always like, yeah, but without that fear of dying, if you give everybody a basic income, now they're not going to be afraid of dying. And without that, and our society runs on fear. Without that fear, our society couldn't run. And maybe we even all think something like, well, I guess that's kind of true. So we do need people to be literally scared to death, or else they're not going to work. If the students aren't going to study, if they're not scared to death. And then the response that Monsters, Inc. introduces is like, what if it's the case that actually So 2 things, I'm just gonna wrap it up. 2 things. One is the response can be sort of like, what if it's the case that actually, what if my students could be motivated to learn not because they're afraid of failing at school, which means failing at life and ultimately dying? What if I could motivate them to learn through joy? What if actually my students would learn more if they were motivated by joy than by fear of death? And in the plane of work, what if it's the case that people would actually not only work just as well, but maybe actually be more productive and work more if we could take their fear of death off the table? And the relationship between the employer and the employee wasn't work or you're literally going to die because I'll stop paying you. What if they could actually work more? It would work better. We'd be a more productive society if we didn't have fear. What if we don't need fear as a motivator? But within the context of like a catalyst for self-reflection, I think that the moment that somebody says something like, has this conversation where you say to somebody, guaranteed basic income, people should have a right, should have that. And then the response is like, yeah, but without scaring people, without fear, they won't be motivated. When people say that, that can be a moment where you realize like, can you just stand back and listen to what you just said? You kind of just said, you're a monster. That like this, that I scare people, and that's justified. Let's just take that as a moment of self-reflection. Like, is that really what you want to be? Is that really the best that we can do as a society? That we use money and people's need for money to scare them. That's what we do. Yeah, so that's my talk. I look forward to having more conversations about it.